new series that we're going to be doing this summer. I mentioned it in the series we just finished through the last school year. You recall we were talking about Presbyterians and the American Revolution, and I suggested, well, maybe this summer we do a little follow-up to that, a kind of sequel in which we talk about the Constitution itself. You know, in the series we just finished, I was arguing that at least a major influence in pre-revolutionary colonial America was the Calvinistic presence, represented by the English Puritans and the Scott Presbyterians, all of whom were thoroughgoing Calvinists, of course, and who represented about 2/3 of the overall population in the colonies prior to the revolutionary conflict. Not all these people, of course, were Orthodox Calvinists, but they were the heirs of that tradition, and certainly in a broader sense, the influence of Calvin, that whole Reformed wing of the Protestant Reformation, was very significantly present and influential in those days, and we were arguing that that in some ways provided the theological groundwork upon which the revolutionary conflict was justified. Well, that influence didn't stop, of course, once the Revolutionary War was successfully won. It was only a few years later, 10 to 15 years later, that we have a constitutional convention. And the purpose of that convention was to establish the political bedrock, the foundation, upon which this colonial experiment would continue. And again, the influence was very much present in the Constitutional Convention, just as it had been prior to the Revolutionary War. So I'm calling this short series The Roots of the American Constitution. There's a whole lot more that could be said on this topic than what I'm going to say, but I'm expecting this will go about 6 weeks or so, and just an opportunity to consider this particular aspect of the colonial historical experiment. All of this in some ways is connected to an incident that took place in my life way back when I was in law school. This was years ago. I had anticipated going to law school and was really looking forward to one particular course that was called Con Law in law school. It was short for constitutional law. I was interested in that topic in particular because, of course, I had earlier than that done some graduate level studies focusing on the colonial Puritans and the English Puritans. And one of the things I discovered, among other things, in connection with those studies was that they were great lawyers. These Puritans were not simply kind of dark religious types, you know, that didn't like to wear bright colors, that kind of thing, but they were brilliant people, and many of them were quite impressive in their legal and political insight. And that was part of what was in many ways driving this entire Puritan movement, both in England, the Presbyterians in Scotland, and of course those that wind up in the colonies. And so I was interested in the subject generally, and I was hoping that by studying constitutional law, I could learn a little bit more about the history of these people. I knew that my law school professor wasn't going to be overly interested in that. I mean, he had other things he had to cover, of course, in the studies, but nevertheless, at least from my point of view, I was hoping something of that would come out. I suppose you can imagine the dismay that I felt one day when, after giving a series of lectures, my law school prof in Con Law stood up and said, this was after detailing a particular point of constitutional law. He simply said to some 75 or so future lawyers of America, so you see, ladies and gentlemen, the Constitution of the United States is just another scrap of paper. Just another scrap of paper. I wasn't too sure what to make of that. I realized that it kind of struck me right at the moment, just like a stab wound, you might say. I knew that he wasn't a great fan of the classical constitutional understanding. He was quite liberal in his political outlook, and I think he rather enjoyed telling us that the Constitution was just another scrap of paper. I think from his point of view, that was probably a good thing, you know. But certainly from my point of view, it was a rather unsettling thing for him to say. And I've carried that, to this day. I do a course just like this one, in part to make good on a promise that I gave about 2 years after hearing that statement. After I had passed the bar, I was there in the Spokane County Superior Court building in one of the courtrooms, and a Superior Court judge was there presiding over this, and he told us all to raise our right hands. And he told us that we should, among other things, take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Just another scrap of paper. Well, you know, I'm a Christian. I tend to take oaths pretty seriously, and so over the years I've from time to time had opportunity to talk about the Constitution, and I'm seizing this as another opportunity to do so, partly because of its own independent interest and partly to make good on that oath that I took so many years ago. So that's what this is going to be about. We're going to be studying the Constitution itself, especially looking at some of the influences that gave rise to its basic structure. We're also going to be considering its content. How is it put together? What are its provisions? That kind of thing. And we're also going to be looking, at least to some degree, on the ways in which the Constitution has been applied, and in my opinion, misapplied, down through the years, right down to the present day. So all of this is fair game for this discussion. I'm calling it the roots of the Constitution, but obviously it's going to be a little broader than that. So that's what we're about. This will be about 6 weeks, I suppose, 6 or 7 weeks. I haven't quite mapped it all out yet, but that's the plan. But before we get started, let's just have a word of prayer and ask God's blessing on this time together. Our Father, we're grateful to you that you have given us this remarkable instrument that we call the American Constitution. It's not perfect, not to be confused with your word, but we certainly appreciate that there's some deep insight in it that really reflects the understanding that does derive from your word. And so we pray that we would be thoughtful and have integrity as we review these matters, and that you would bless this time together now in Jesus' name. Amen. I think you know I'm here by myself at home. I don't have a live audience. I kind of like a live audience, but right now it's just you and me talking about these things, so I'm glad to have you along and have you interested in these matters. Well, you know that the Constitution begins with 3 rather weighty words. The words, we the people. We the people. That in itself is quite a novelty. I know we tend to take it for granted, you know, we the people, okay, fine. But you need to understand that at the time, and certainly in some period earlier, this was a rather radical and unexpected idea. We go back to Calvin, of course, who would be the person that probably most famously gave us the notion that all people are created equal. Sometimes we think Thomas Jefferson ginned that up on his own, or maybe got it from the French Enlightenment, but no, he got it from that Calvinistic tradition. Remember, the French Enlightenment wiped out all of their nobility. The one thing they didn't believe was that all people were created equal, and they put the guillotine to people that they thought were unequal in the wrong direction. But it was Calvin who gave us that particular principle, and it's out of that principle that this phrase, we the people, originates. Where did Calvin get it? Well, he got it from the Bible. He got it essentially from 2 important aspects of biblical instruction, one of which we would call the dignity of a human being. We come into this world in what's called the imago Dei, the image of God. And that's a remarkable and very honorable kind of designation for us. We have this ability to bear his image. The idea there is to be reflective of God's image, like a mirror could reflect the sunshine, you might say. We are not God, we're not to be confused with God, but we have this remarkable capacity to reflect the greatness of God, the holiness of God. And that's a great benefit, a great honor to us, and it applies to every living human being. Nobody's exempt from that. Everybody comes into this world with that great benefit, and Calvin emphasizes that. But he also emphasizes kind of the flip side of that proposition, namely that all people are broken. Calvin called this total depravity. Maybe a better term is radical corruption. We have something wrong deep inside us. And I don't need to prove that to you. We've seen plenty of evidence through history. One historian said on one occasion that history is really the story of who is shedding whose blood at any given moment. Isn't that true? You know, the world is not in this fragile condition because of a disagreement among kangaroos. It's human beings that bring us to the brink of human destruction again and again. Calvin was very much aware of that. All thoughtful human beings, of course, have recognized that there's something deeply wrong about the human species. And that's why when you shut out the lights, people tend toward anarchy, they tend toward destruction, they tend toward miserable behavior. And Calvin had both of those in view. We have great dignity on the one hand, and yet it's a broken, shattered dignity on the other. And he also insisted at that point, we all are created equal. All of us come into this world sharing both of those aspects of our human situation. And that applies no matter who you are. If you're a king ruling over a great empire, or if you're a pauper working out in a field, doesn't matter. At this point, we are all equal. Nobody has some kind of special status. When Calvin worked this idea out in the mid-1500s, that was almost unheard of. People would have shaken their heads in disbelief at such an idea because it was taken for granted. It was taken for granted that some people come into this world in a superior status. Aristotle said it. He said some people are born to rule, some people are born to be slaves. I mean, this was classical Western understanding and certainly worldwide understanding down through the centuries. Some people are nobility, some people are common, some people are aristocrats, some people are kings, and they have the divine right of kings, that they can do no wrong. The king is right just because he does what he does. He is the law. That idea, we see it as a little bit foreign as Americans, but in the mid-1500s, that was taken for granted. And for Calvin to come along and say, oh, no, everybody comes into this world on equal turf, equal status, was revolutionary in the extreme. But he believed it because he believed that's what the Bible teaches. And those who were influenced by Calvin picked up that idea and began to implement it more broadly. He himself had some good things to say about political theory, but it was really in many ways those who came after who developed that much more thoroughly. The Calvinistic influence was, of course, felt in many different places, but especially in Britain, that is in England, in the form of the Puritans, and in Scotland in the form of the Presbyterians. The Puritans and the Presbyterians basically had the same theology. They went by a different name, but they had the same theology. They all bought off on the Westminster Confession of Faith, which was formulated in the mid-1600s. And these were principally the people then who came across the pond and settled here in the colonies and became, of course, that fundamental Calvinist presence in the colonies from that point on. And these people took that and sort of applied it, in a sense, in their political understanding, and came to the conviction, and you'd find this in Calvin as well, but they came to the conviction that government is created by the people. Government doesn't come on the scene sort of as an independent creation to rule over the people. The people themselves create the government. So the basis of governmental authority is, in fact, we, the people. Let me just put it to you this way. From this point of view, government does not grant rights to people. God grants rights to people. We can call them unalienable rights because they come straight from God. They're not mediated through any intermediate kind of human institution. God gives rights straight to the people because everybody comes into this world on equal footing. There's nobody that's born with an automatic right to rule. You see, we're all equal at this point. So the rights are given to the people, and then the people have the opportunity to assign authority to governmental agencies. And that's the way it works. Rights to the people, and then the creation of governmental structures based on the fact that rights were given to the people. It's important to understand this, and I might just mention in passing that, of course, the American constitutional experiment is not a democracy, at least not a pure democracy. In fact, the founding fathers were pretty hostile, if you've read them, to the idea of a pure democracy. Pure democracies really mean that you just kind of take a majority vote every time a major decision comes along. The founders didn't like that because that was as much of a peril from their point of view as was having a king with a divine right. Both of them can take us to a very dark place. The idea was, of course, a pure majority can be easily manipulated. Demagogues can arise and they can arouse in people sentiments that are not healthy, not right, go in a bad direction, and yet in a moment they can really create out of a majority a mob, and the mob can do some horrible things. And so the founding fathers would never have called this the American democracy. I know we hear that term a lot, and it's probably okay, but I think it's much better for us to recognize that we are not a democracy, we are a republic. A res publica is the term. It goes back to the Romans, a public thing. We are a public thing, and there's certainly a democratic element in it, and yet a republic is different from a democracy. A republic rests on two great pillars, and again you would find this worked out in Calvin and some of his successors. One of the pillars is called rule of law, Lex Rex, that famous book written by Samuel Rutherford. He's a Presbyterian, Scot, scholar, philosopher, and he gave us a book that was highly influential at the time of the framing of the United States Constitution, the notion of the rule of law, not the rule of people, not the rule of one person, an absolute monarch, or the rule of many people, the majority. No, the rule of law. The rule of law. And then the other pillar upon which a republic rests is the notion of representation. The idea is that the people have the authority to create offices of government and to assign authority not to people but to offices. So the law creates offices, and the offices have authority. And if a person holds the office, they have the authority, but only so long as they hold the office. Once a person leaves that office, they leave the authority behind. They have no intrinsic authority, only official authority. And that's really what a republic is. It's an arrangement in which the people choose, this is the democratic element, choose those who will be put into offices that were already created by we the people, you see. And so it is a kind of Republican approach. That's why in our Pledge of Allegiance, we pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the, what? Republic for which it stands. That's why we call ourselves a republic, and that really is the distinctive character of our approach. I mentioned the Romans actually came up with it, the res publica, the republic. They rejected monarchy in 507 and put in place what they called the Roman Republic, and it worked for a while. But eventually, I think it kept kind of spiraling downwards until finally it became absolute monarchy once again. And the Caesars, of course, ruled all through the early centuries there after the Republic had basically collapsed. The reason the Roman Republic didn't work so well was because they lacked that theological root. They didn't really have a robust idea that our rights come from God. And so even though they were experimenting with a republic, in many ways they kind of missed the boat, and that's why I think it didn't ultimately succeed. In fact, if you look in the ancient world for the best example of a republic, I think you could probably find it in the Hebrew Republic. I know the ancient land of Israel had various governmental structures. They had a king sometimes, they had a kind of an aristocracy sometimes, they had the elders, they had various branches. But if you look at the underlying themes, kind of the common denominators coming from Moses that really tied all of this together, you'd have to say that fundamentally it did represent a republican form of government. Nobody had absolute power. The king certainly didn't. In many ways, the king was the most restricted person in the republic because not only was he supposed to obey all the other laws incumbent on people, but he had a special set of laws, Deuteronomy 17, that applied just to him. So there was a very significant sense in which there was a division of labor. Founding fathers often studied the Bible closely. John Adams was a deep student of the scriptures who said on one occasion, quote, "The Bible is the most republican book ever written." It's a remarkable statement, and I think it's true. I think John Adams got the right idea, and that, again, is part of what informed him as one of our founding fathers. So here's the idea. We get this right, unalienable rights from God, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, and others besides those. We have these rights, and in order to help us enjoy those rights, we create government, and fundamentally government is created to restrain evil actions by evil people. It's all of us. The old saying, Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, that's demonstrable in history. And so there was a significant attempt to say by we the people that we were going to prevent that level of authority to be assigned to any one person. So we have this ability to create offices. We put people in those offices, but we put them there provisionally. You might say we put them there on good behavior. But if in fact they begin to abuse their authority, begin to act outside their authority, began to try to usurp authority that was not rightfully theirs, we have the power of the ballot box to throw the bums out, as the old saying goes, and that's precisely what we have the power to do. It's because all of those unalienable rights eventually have to be traced back to the human people who are involved in this rather than to various branches of government. So we have intrinsic rights, and the people assign the authority to the government. I think it's important to note the government itself has no rights as such. God doesn't give rights to government as such. He certainly recognizes that we need government. Romans 13, among other texts, make that perfectly clear. But the fact that the rights, the unalienable rights, finally come to people. We assign authority to government, and on that basis we have what becomes a proper arrangement for understanding our governmental situation. Thomas Paine, of course, was no Calvinist, but he was reflecting a fairly Calvinistic idea when he said, quote, "All power exercised over a nation must have some beginning." All power has to start somewhere. And then he gives us two options. It must either be delegated or assumed, says Thomas Paine. Delegated or assumed. There's no other sources, he says. All delegated power is trust. It's an important line. When we, the people, delegate authority to a governmental office, it's a matter of trust. That is to say, the person holding the office has a fiduciary obligation to discharge the duties and to exercise the authority of that office for the good of those who put him there. That's delegated authority, and it's based on trust. He says all assumed power is usurpation. When people come in with an iron fist and simply exercise dominion in a kind of tyranny over others, and do so simply on the basis of the exercise of raw force, that's usurpation. Mao Zedong, of course, famously said, all political power comes out of the muzzle of a gun. Well, maybe from his point of view that was right. I think there's a lot of people who thought that. But the fact of the matter is, when you see people exercising political power by burning down buildings, causing riots, threatening, otherwise engaging in behavior which has nothing to do with sound, reasonable politics, you realize that you're dealing with something other than delegated power. Time, says Paine, does not alter the nature and quality of either. Well, we were quite conscious of this, and Thomas Paine reflects it in this statement. And of course, it was on that basis that we wanted to take the path of assigned authority. We wanted to say we're going to create these, but it's going to be we the people who do this. And we're going to hold our government accountable based on the limitations that are included in the constitutional document we have before us here. So, what's the implication of this? Well, one implication is that you and I should be somewhat expert in the Constitution. Now, you might be rolling your eyes when I say that, because it's easy to think that, well, you know, hey, constitutional law, that's for people who've been to law school and they are very smart and think deeply about these things and have careers that involve them in that all the time. And that's an unfortunate misunderstanding, because in fact the Constitution is really quite readable, quite comprehensible, and its sense is pretty obvious. And for us to sort of delegate to so-called experts what should be our expertise is probably a real breach of our fiduciary obligation along the way. When I say expert here, I don't mean a technical expert, read every Supreme Court case, anything like that. I just mean to have a basic familiarity with what's going on in the Constitution and what our responsibilities are vis-a-vis the government that's created through the Constitution. So that implies that we know what the Constitution says. We know what the words of the Constitution mean. And by that I intend what they were intended to mean. What do those words mean? Not what we have sort of morphed them to mean over time, which is really an act of dishonesty, but what were the words intended to mean in history by the people that wrote them? And then to ask ourselves, has there been an abuse? Has there been a departure from what's contained in those words in subsequent history? Has the Supreme Court or other branches of government somehow departed from what was set forth in the Constitution? And if so, then it becomes our task to, rise to the occasion, to raise the issue, to do what we can to try to call attention to this, because actually the government is our creation. And so we have a duty, in a sense, to keep an eye on government and make sure that it's playing by the rules that we, the people, have created. The chief defense, of course, we have to abuses of power is the ballot box. That's why we've built into our constitutional republic frequent elections. Every 2 years we are able to elect a pretty good sized body of people that go off to Washington, D.C. That in itself is a pretty significant opportunity to be involved. And there are other ways in which we can be involved. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but I think you realize that it still comes back to us and the responsibility that we bear. We, the people, should understand the Constitution and should keep an eye on our government. That's really what we're called to do. I might mention at this point, private citizens, you in your private capacity as a private citizen are not able to violate the Constitution of the United States. Did you know that? It is a law, it's the supreme law of the land, but it's a law that is binding on government. The Constitution binds government, it doesn't bind private citizens. Now, there are laws that bind us for sure, and the Constitution contemplates that there will be those kind of legislative bodies, but the Constitution itself is intended to create and limit the power of government. And if we keep that in mind, then I think it helps us understand what's going on. So what are the roots of the American Constitution? Well, I've indicated to you those Calvinistic traditions that comes largely through two sources. One would be the Scott Presbyterians. You know the name John Knox. He founded the Presbyterian Church there in Scotland in the mid-1500s. He wrote a remarkable book that was called the Book of Discipline. It was really a far-ranging attempt to create, you might say, in Scotland, a vision for how to do not only church, but how to do government. And the Book of Discipline, if you read it, you realize it really was kind of an early attempt to create the very thing our Constitution did create. It wasn't perfect, but it was really a rather remarkable attempt to get at that, and so John Knox should be credited with being one of the first voices to apply in the political world the theology that he himself had learned personally from John Calvin. Samuel Rutherford was a Scott Presbyterian scholar, philosopher. He wrote the book Lex Rex, I mentioned earlier. Law is king. Not Rex Lex, king is law. That had been the rule up until then. No, the law is the king, and so the law is that which we sort of enshrine in our system of governance. If you go to Washington, D.C., of course, we have statues of people, Lincoln and so on, but the real shrines, the national shrines of our government are pieces of paper. You ever thought about that? The National Archives, those are pieces of paper which we consider to be sacred. Those are our king, you might say, the rule of law. Samuel Rutherford developed that in a powerful way, and of course, as I said earlier, it was very influential to the Founding Fathers when the Constitution was being crafted. John Witherspoon, you know that name, he was a Founding Father. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a Presbyterian. He came from Scotland, migrated here actually. Not only was he a Founding Father, but he was also a very important character otherwise. He was the president of the College of New Jersey, which was a Presbyterian institution. The College of New Jersey had been the Log College. It was founded by William Tennant, managed by his son Gilbert Tennant over the years. But eventually it was fully chartered, became kind of a legitimate school, you might say, and it was a Presbyterian school that operated. And one of its presidents, one of the most important, was John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon, of course, was a chief educator at the college, and many of the Founding Fathers, a surprising number, came through the College of New Jersey and were more or less imprinted, you might say, by the thought of the Presbyterian scholar John Witherspoon. So we have the Scottish Presbyterians on the one hand, we have the English Puritans on the other. The other major population that came, Massachusetts Bay, of course, founded by Puritans. John Winthrop preached his famous sermon, A City on a Hill. It was already casting a vision for this kind of life and political structure. Maybe one of the most important names we could mention in connection with the English Puritans is a character by the name of John Locke. You've heard of John Locke. He's a philosopher, a British empiricist, but he also wrote quite a bit in terms of civil governance. And that became one of the most important documents, again, influencing the founding fathers in connection with the creation of the Constitution. We wouldn't technically call John Locke a Puritan, but he is the next thing to it. His father was certainly a Puritan. His father fought under Oliver Cromwell in the Puritan revolt that took place between 1640 and 1660. He was very much involved. He would be a legitimate Puritan, and Locke probably was too, but his work was more in the area of politics, you might say, and so we think of him more in terms of his political theory. John Locke famously started right off in his work affirming human equality. Well, where did he get that? See, he got that from the Calvinistic tradition, the Puritan tradition of which he was a part, affirming equality on the same basis that Calvin himself had taught it. He taught that God-given rights are given to the people. He called them natural rights. That is, they're not given by government. They're not given by any agency that is human in character. They're given in nature by God. God is the one who inscribes those rights into nature. And he included in those unalienable rights things like life and liberty and property and pursuit of happiness and other elements that we are familiar with. All of those, of course, come from the language of John Locke. He argued quite clearly that the people grant power to civil authorities. This is precisely what we did in the American experiment in government. He also argued that when the government begins to abuse its authority, that the support can be withdrawn. He actually argued for the right of people to resist and indeed revolt if a government becomes tyranny. Now, we're a long way from revolting. I don't want to suggest or be misunderstood here, but I do think it's important for us to understand the history of this document and to do whatever we can that is important in making sure that the government that we've created is in fact playing by the right rules. So John Locke established the idea that the people have sovereignty over the government. You see, you hear that? The people have sovereignty over the government, not vice versa. We the people have created this. We've created it for our good, but we've never given away the fundamental right that we have, which came from God himself. Thomas Jefferson regarded John Locke as one of the three most important men in all of human history. That's a pretty remarkable statement, isn't it? The other two were John Newton and Roger Bacon, if you're interested. I don't know that I'd agree with his list there, but nevertheless, that's how highly esteemed John Locke was in the mind, at least of Thomas Jefferson. Well, the other character we should probably think about as we're thinking about roots of this Constitution is our friend James Madison. James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, and rightly so. He basically wrote the fundamental constitutional document, and then obviously it was subjected to a great deal of critique and so on. There was a lot of debate and modifications along the way, but fundamentally we would say James Madison wrote the document. James Madison was educated at the College of New Jersey. That's where he went to college. He was so brilliant that John Witherspoon, the Presbyterian, asked James Madison to stick around for an extra year. And James Madison agreed. And for 1 year, the two of them, in a kind of private advanced educational program, worked together. This would be what we might call like a master's degree, that James Madison was really absorbing not only theological but political theory, John Witherspoon had a robust political outlook, very Calvinistic himself, coming from Scotland, informed by John Knox. He just poured all of that into James Madison. James Madison carried that education with him throughout his career. There was a time when he actually was contemplating becoming a pastor. He was so impressed, of course, with John Witherspoon and with the call of the gospel that at least for a time he thought about that. But there were voices that suggested to James Madison, you know, your interests might be better served at this critical moment in the history of the colonies to devote yourself to political theory. And that's what Madison did, and we're glad he did, because as I say, he's commonly viewed the father of the American Constitution. So what did he create? He created a document that was definitely organized along Presbyterian lines. In a sense, he took what had been taken for granted in the sort of ecclesiastical structure of the church and applied it in a political setting, modifying it, of course, to be appropriate for a political arrangement, but nevertheless, it was fundamentally a Presbyterian approach. James Madison assumed, as do all Calvinists, that people are fundamentally broken. That for that reason, as well-intentioned as they may be, you can never quite trust them completely. Madison said famously in Federalist 10, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. But men are not angels, and so we do need government. We cannot give any one person too much power because inevitably they will abuse it. We understand that, and so what Madison had to do was work out a very delicate balance. Because people are evil, they need to be restrained, at least at the point of their evil intents. I mean, people shouldn't be restrained for every purpose. They should be free. They should be able to do what they want, get a job in the career they want, marry the person they want, live where they want, come and go as they please. There should be liberty. I mean, this is really at the heart of what we understand. But if I want to go throw a brick through a window, or if I want to go rob somebody or otherwise injure them, then there need to be restraints. Because inevitably there are people who will want to do such things. And so government has to have sufficient authority to restrain evil, but not so much authority that becomes a tyranny. This is one formulation of what's called the Madisonian dilemma, in which he was trying to balance, on the one hand, giving the sufficient authority to government that it can do its job, but not so much authority that it itself becomes our worst enemy. And so he crafted a document that was essentially designed to do just that. The document creates authority and then limits the amount of power that's exercised in it. He does this by an elaborate system of checks and balances. We have a balance of authority between the federal government and the state governments. At the federal level, we slice and dice authorities. We have three branches of government. The most powerful of the three branches, the legislative itself, is split in two. So we have a more aristocratic House, the Senate, and a more democratic House, the House of Representatives. And those two kind of balance each other, and each has its own concerns and so on. I think you get the point, you know, that Madison is doing everything he can to make a complicated array of various offices that each has its own authority and is delimited by the jurisdiction given to other offices, so that this thing hangs together as a kind of quilt of a variety of offices that all more or less have the requisite power to do the job of government, but nobody becomes too powerful and becomes abusive or tyrannical. We know a lot about what Madison thought of the Constitution because he was the major author of what's called the Federalist. The Federalist was a series of newspaper articles that were published in New York originally, attempting to persuade the New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution. You know, it was somewhat up for grabs for a while there. He was joined by a couple of others, James Madison, John Jay. The three of them wrote the Federalist Papers. They did it under a pen name, Publius, so nobody knew at the time who was writing what, or even who was writing at all, but those were very important documents. And if we read them, we get a lot of the thinking, you might say, in Madison that went into this document. Madison also wrote the original Bill of Rights. Interestingly, James Madison himself wasn't so sure we needed a Bill of Rights. He thought it was superfluous, really. He thought that he had so carefully circumscribed the powers of the government, the enumerated powers of Congress and so on, that he thought really it was not necessary to add a Bill of Rights, that in fact it might have a negative effect. He actually made that argument. But the Anti-Federalists made it clear that they were not going to buy off on this Constitution, people like Patrick Henry and others, unless there was a Bill of Rights, unless it was specifically spelled out in the Constitution what the rights are that are given to the people. And the people are given the rights precisely to protect them against tyrannical government. It was like the balance against the government that was being created to vest in people the ability to escape from tyrannical exercise of power by the government. So what are the functions of the Constitution? It grants power to various agencies of government, branches of government. It limits the powers so granted, and by so doing, it secures the rights of the people against abuses. You really gather that from the purposes of the Constitution that are spelled out in the preamble. The preamble begins with the words, "We the people," and then to form a more perfect union, and so on, delineates the rights and so on that are going to be established in this Constitution. Well, the first of these is, in fact, to form a more perfect union. Why was that necessary? Well, because we had a very imperfect union at the time. After the Revolutionary War had been successfully fought and won, we had what were called the Articles of Confederation. But really, the Articles of Confederation formed a very weak central government. It was more like a treaty among 13 independent states. And it became clear after a while that we needed something with a little bit more robust power in order to really pull us together as one nation. There were actually threats at the time that one state might go to war against another state. Can you imagine that? If Virginia declares war on North Carolina or something like that. But that was exactly the threat that seemed to be brewing. And so there was an attempt by this document to create a more perfect union. In other words, to find a way in which all 13 of these states could, in fact, be able to coexist in a more amicable kind of way. It was in that connection that the second point was to establish justice. Justice not so much within each state, that really was more the function of the Republican government, which was required in each of the 13 states, but rather to establish justice among the states. Because some were more powerful than others, some were more populated, some had all kinds of different advantages that others didn't share, and it was easy for one state to be bullied by another. And so there needed to be a just arrangement among these 13 colonies so that each of them would have sort of an equal opportunity to exercise their rights and so on in the community of colonies that were here. To ensure domestic tranquility, again, the threat of violence among the colonies was a lively problem. And the hope was to create a kind of tranquil relationship among the several states. And the Constitution spends a fair amount of its attention doing that very thing. To provide for the common defense. Obviously, one nation needs to have one consolidated defense. If some foreign power came in and attacked Virginia, then obviously the rest of the colonies should rally to the defense of that one state, and that's really part of what the Constitution does. One of the more ambiguous and probably problematic of these 6 purposes was to promote the general welfare. Now, there was a fairly limited idea of what that meant at the time, but people realized that it could become kind of a wide open phrase to allow for a lot of abuses. They were aware of that at the time. And I would say in the Constitution, probably the 2 clauses that have the greatest potential for abuse would be the Commerce Clause, which we'll look at a later time, and the General Welfare Clause, which really does authorize this federal government to do things for the general welfare. Just a word about that in a minute, but we'll finish our list here. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That was fundamental, that we should be a free people. We should be a free people, that we should be able to come and go as we please, that we should be able to, virtually in every aspect of life, dictate the terms of our own lives, and only be restrained by government when our intentions are taking us in a destructive direction. On that general welfare clause, Thomas Jefferson made an interesting comment. He said, quote, "It would reduce, that is, the general welfare clause would reduce the whole instrument to a single phrase, namely general welfare, that of instituting a Congress with power to do whatever would be good for the United States." That sounds good, doesn't it? This is allowing the government to do whatever's good for the United States. Jefferson wasn't so sure about that. He continued, "And as they would be the sole judges of the good or evil, it would also be a power to do whatever evil they please." There's the problem, you see. The general welfare clause can cut both ways because it doesn't have a good definition, really. It certainly meant something at the time, but is susceptible to abuse, and indeed has been abused. He continued, "The Constitution was intended to lace them up," that is the government, "straightly within the enumerated power, and those without which as means these powers could not be carried into effect." Jefferson thought that general welfare clause could be problematic, and indeed it has been. We'll talk more about that at a later time. Well, I'm going to wrap things up here, but I just want to remind you that the Constitution creates a government with three branches. I was watching a news show not too long ago, and it was kind of a man on the street interview, you know, and they walk up to someone and say, "What are the branches of the United States government?" Not one person was able to answer the question. Now, maybe they were cherry picking the people they were asking, but I thought this is not good, you know, when something as fundamental as this question is posed to people who are American citizens, and they can't answer it, then you think we have some homework to do. And so I know you're well educated, so I know this is not news to you, but you know that our government is based on three branches. Some have actually seen a little hint of Trinity in the three branches. I'm not going that far, but I think, you know, it's at least interesting. We have these three branches of government. The first of them, the legislative; the second, the executive; the third, the judicial. The legislative branch we call Congress. The executive branch we call the presidency. The judicial branch we call the Supreme Court. You'll notice I put little percentage numbers there beside each one of these. What I'm doing is giving you, now this is from me, okay, so you know, this is not, I can't get this from Madison or somebody, but I think you can infer it from Madison, that this is the relative power of each of the branches. Now it may surprise you. You might have thought, well, we have three equal branches, but not by the original design. That was not at all what was in mind. We are fundamentally what's called a parliamentary form of government. We parley, we speak, we debate, we do the kinds of things in an open conversation that are hopefully going to bring wisdom to surface so that you know, the lawmaking branch of our government can act responsibly. We call that Congress, and I would give it about 50% of the total power of our government. Congress can ultimately get its way. It can overrule a presidential veto. It takes a supermajority, but it can be done. It can even overrule the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court says, okay, Congress, the law you just enacted is not constitutional, well, Congress could theoretically you know, put together a constitutional amendment. It would have to be ratified by a certain portion of the states, but it would be Congress that would do that, and once it becomes an amendment, it's Constitution, and so the Supreme Court could even be overruled by the Congress. My point is, I'm giving it about half the power. That's not absolute power, obviously, but it is a fair amount of power, and that's by design. The executive branch, 40%. The executive branch has plenty of power. It can veto a bill, but as I say, the veto could be overridden. There are certain other powers that the executive branch enjoys, and all of those, of course, are part of its function as well. And so these two have this dance that they play, and of course there has to be a certain amount of compromise, typically, to get things done. And that's by design. It's so that nobody becomes too powerful. The judicial branch, I'm only giving 10%. Now that may surprise you. I'm a lawyer. You know, you'd think I'd give more to the judicial branch here, but actually it's only about 10%. The way to think about this is, you know, if you imagine going to a basketball game and there's two teams. One team is called legislative branch and one team is called executive branch. You know, so there they are. They're playing their basketball game. We know that one team is a little better than the other, and in the ordinary course of events, it's going to win. But there will be upsets occasionally where the other team wins as well, and that's just the way the political game is played. There's a third class of people out there on the gym floor, and they are called referees. They wear striped shirts, you know. Their task is to make sure the other two teams play by the rules. Isn't that right? What would you think if you went to a basketball game and all of a sudden one of the referees just in the middle of the game grabs the ball, dribbles down the floor and scores a basket, and then you look up at the scoreboard and realize the referees have their own score? I think most of us would realize, wait a minute, the referees are way outside the bounds of their appropriate responsibility, you know. Or what if a referee in the middle of the game just stopped and said, okay, we're going to change the rules of the game. Anyone who shoots the ball from here gets 4 points. We'd say, well, this isn't your job. You don't have the right to just make the rules up or to score points yourself. You're not a team. You're just making sure the others play by the rules. We'd have an intuitive, immediate understanding that there was a violation of the role that was being played by the referees. That's precisely what the U.S. Supreme Court is supposed to do. It's supposed to look at the actions of the other two branches and make sure that they are playing by the rules. They're not supposed to make up the rules, although they often have. They're not supposed to try to score political points themselves, although when you see people rallying in front of the Supreme Court building with placards and signs and trying to lobby the Supreme Court, you know the court has become a political body, and that is a very unhealthy development. Robert Bork wrote a book some years back entitled The Tempting of America. And the entire thesis of that very scholarly book was to say the temptation we have faced in America is to let the Supreme Court become political. And when it becomes political, then the entire game changes. And that's really in some ways what we've seen over the years, and it continues to be the case. Well, we should be aware of that. We should be thinking about the relative rules that are the rules by which each of these branches of government is to conduct itself, and we should be doing what we can to try to steer us back in that direction. You know, it's not too late, but we do need to sort of raise our voice of concern if we see government behaving in a way that goes beyond its appropriate powers. All right, well, I'm going to leave it off at this point. I appreciate your sticking around and seeing us through this presentation. As I say, we're going to be uploading one of these a week or so as we go through the summer months. And I'll be trying to expand on some of these themes and go into a little bit of detail as to some of the issues that have arisen, some of the cases that have been decided, and some of the implications of those cases. So I hope that as we go along, you'll be able to participate with us as we do so. And so until then, we'll wrap it up at this point with my hearty thanks for you participating, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.